The quickest way to misunderstand a person is to judge them before learning the story they never tell. The breakfast rush had barely begun when Daniel Brooks decided that humiliation would be louder than kindness. Plates moved across the crowded dining room. Coffee steamed beneath warm lights. Conversations blended with the steady sound of silverware against porcelain. In the middle of it all, Emily Carter carried a fresh pot of coffee toward a family celebrating their grandmother's birthday. She walked carefully, smiling with the quiet confidence that came from years of serving others without asking for recognition. Before she reached the table, Daniel's sharp voice cut through the restaurant. "Emily, even a beginner could move faster than that." Every nearby conversation faded. Customers turned their heads. Several employees lowered their eyes, pretending not to notice. Daniel folded his arms and continued, his tone filled with unnecessary impatience. "If you spent less time daydreaming and more time working, maybe we would not have so many complaints." Emily stopped for only a moment. She looked at the coffee pot in her hand, took one slow breath, and walked the remaining few steps before gently refilling each customer's cup without spilling a single drop. She apologized to the family for the interruption even though she had done nothing wrong. The grandmother smiled kindly and thanked her for always remembering exactly how everyone liked their coffee. Emily returned the smile before quietly continuing her work. She never defended herself. She never argued. Across the dining room, a man sitting alone near the window watched every second unfold. William Hayes visited the restaurant often, though very few people recognized him without the headlines and television cameras that usually surrounded his public appearances. Dressed in a simple charcoal jacket instead of an expensive suit, he looked like any other customer enjoying a quiet breakfast. Yet his eyes never left Emily. Most people would have remembered Daniel's harsh words. William noticed something else entirely. Every employee who crossed paths with Emily received a gentle smile. A nervous new hostess accidentally dropped a stack of menus, and Emily quietly helped gather them before anyone could complain. A cook pushed through the swinging kitchen doors carrying heavy trays, and Emily stepped aside with a grateful nod instead of frustration. Even after being embarrassed in front of a full dining room, she continued treating everyone with the same calm respect. William stirred his untouched coffee slowly. Something about her silence felt deliberate rather than defeated. It was the kind of silence carried by someone protecting a truth too valuable to explain. And for reasons he could not yet understand, seeing Daniel mock that quiet dignity awakened a memory William had spent 15 years trying to forget. William Hayes remained at his table long after the breakfast crowd had begun to thin. The coffee in front of him had grown cold, yet he barely noticed. His attention followed Emily Carter as she moved through the dining room with the same quiet composure she had shown only minutes after Daniel Brooks had embarrassed her in front of everyone. Most people would have carried resentment across their faces. Emily carried only patience. A young father struggled to calm his restless toddler before finishing breakfast, and Emily quietly brought over a small cup filled with colorful crayons and a clean paper placemat without interrupting the family. An elderly couple searched for the reading glasses they had misplaced beneath a folded newspaper. Before they even realized where they had fallen, Emily gently picked them up and placed them beside the coffee mug with a warm smile. Every small gesture seemed effortless, as though kindness had become part of her daily routine instead of something she consciously chose. William noticed another detail that everyone else seemed to overlook. Every employee, from the dishwasher to the line cooks, relaxed whenever Emily walked into the kitchen. She thanked everyone by name. She complimented a young cook for perfectly preparing scrambled eggs during the morning rush. She quietly helped a busboy stack heavy trays even though she had her own tables waiting. Yet when Daniel entered the room, conversations immediately became shorter, smiles disappeared, and the atmosphere turned noticeably heavier. Emily never changed her behavior. She treated Daniel with the same respect she showed every other person in the building, answering every request with calm professionalism despite the obvious imbalance in how she was treated. William slowly stirred his coffee again, not because it needed stirring but because the rhythm helped him think. Successful businesses often claim their greatest asset was people, yet very few leaders ever stop long enough to recognize the quiet individuals holding everything together. As Daniel criticized schedules, complained about service times, and searched for another mistake to correct, Emily silently prevented problems before they reached the dining room. A spilled glass disappeared before customers noticed. A delayed order arrived with a sincere apology and fresh bread. A nervous new employee received gentle encouragement instead of criticism. None of those moments appeared remarkable on their own. Together they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. William had spent decades building companies by identifying hidden value where others saw nothing special. Looking across the restaurant now, he realized he was witnessing another kind of hidden value. It was not measured in profits or quarterly reports. It lived inside character. And somewhere deep in his memory, that quiet strength continued pulling him toward a forgotten chapter of his own life that refused to remain buried. Over the next several days William Hayes found himself returning to the restaurant at different hours without telling anyone why. Sometimes he arrived for breakfast before the city had fully awakened. Other times he stopped by during the busy lunch rush or just before closing when exhausted employees quietly counted the final receipts. Each visit revealed another piece of the same remarkable pattern. Emily Carter never searched for attention, yet somehow every difficult situation seemed to become easier the moment she stepped into it. One afternoon a young server accidentally entered the wrong order for a table of impatient business clients. Before frustration could spread across the dining room, Emily calmly approached the guests with a sincere apology, personally coordinated with the kitchen, and returned only minutes later carrying fresh meals along with complimentary desserts approved by the chef. The customers left smiling instead of complaining. No one applauded Emily. She simply thanked the kitchen staff for working so quickly and continued serving her own tables. William watched carefully from the corner booth. Later that evening an elderly dishwasher struggled to lift several heavy boxes into the storage room. Emily quietly placed her serving tray aside, carried the boxes one by one without hesitation, then returned to the dining room before anyone noticed she had disappeared. Even Daniel Brooks failed to recognize that another problem had quietly been solved before reaching his attention. What fascinated William most was not what Emily did. It was what she never mentioned afterward. She never reminded anyone of her kindness. She never expected praise. She never corrected the false impression that everything simply worked because of good luck. During another visit William noticed a customer leave an expensive leather wallet beneath the table while rushing out to answer a phone call. Emily immediately picked it up, confirmed the identification inside without opening anything else, and hurried across the parking lot just in time to return it before the driver pulled away. The grateful customer offered several $100s as a reward. Emily politely declined every dollar with the same gentle smile William had now seen countless times. She accepted only a heartfelt thank you before walking back into the restaurant. Standing near the entrance, William felt another distant memory pressing ag. That evening William Hayes returned to his office overlooking the city skyline, but for the first time in years the impressive view failed to capture his attention. Instead, his thoughts remained inside the quiet restaurant where a waitress had somehow reminded him of a life he had nearly forgotten. He pressed a single button on his desk phone and asked his executive assistant to locate an archived personnel file connected to one of the darkest periods of his early career. The request sounded unusual even to him. 15 years earlier, before success had transformed his life, William had spent several difficult months struggling to keep a small technology startup alive. Investors had disappeared. Bills had accumulated. More than once he had questioned whether he should simply walk away from everything he had worked to build. There had been one rainy evening during that season when he entered a small neighborhood diner carrying little more than exhaustion and quiet disappointment. The memory remained incomplete, like an old photograph faded by time. He could not clearly remember the waitress who had served him. He could not remember the name of the diner. Yet one feeling had survived with remarkable clarity. Someone had treated him with unexpected kindness without asking who he was or what he could offer in return. An hour later a storage specialist arrived carrying several sealed archive boxes that had followed William through every corporate headquarters his company had occupied. Together they opened folders filled with faded receipts, handwritten notes, business licenses, and newspaper clippings documenting the uncertain beginning of Caldwell Technologies. William patiently searched through every page until a worn paper envelope slipped onto the desk. Inside rested a faded customer receipt from a small family restaurant that no longer existed. Attached to it was a handwritten note folded neatly in half. The ink had faded, but the message remained readable. Everyone deserves one good meal before giving up. Tomorrow may surprise you. William stared silently at the familiar handwriting. His heartbeat slowed as another forgotten image surfaced. A young waitress with gentle eyes had quietly refused to let him pay for the meal after noticing how discouraged he looked. She had simply smiled, placed the note beside the check, and walked away before he could thank her properly. He had promised himself that if life ever gave him another chance, he would someday repay that simple act of kindness. Looking again at Emily Carter's calm smile from earlier that week, William suddenly realized why the memory had refused to leave him. The handwriting on the old note looked remarkably similar to the careful handwriting he had recently noticed on every order ticket Emily prepared inside the restaurant. The following morning William Hayes returned to the restaurant carrying the old paper envelope inside the pocket of his jacket. He had no intention of revealing anything yet. Too many questions remained unanswered, and he refused to build conclusions from memories alone. As he entered the dining room, the familiar rhythm of breakfast surrounded him once again. Coffee machines hummed behind the counter. Fresh biscuits emerged from the kitchen. Customers greeted one another with sleepy smiles while sunlight poured through the front windows. Emily Carter welcomed every table with the same calm warmth that had first caught William's attention. She had no idea the man sitting quietly near the window was studying every small detail with growing certainty. During a brief pause between orders, Emily stepped behind the service station and began organizing handwritten meal tickets into neat stacks before carrying them toward the kitchen. William noticed the graceful slant of every letter, the careful spacing, and the distinctive way she crossed each lowercase letter T. His heartbeat quickened. It looked almost identical to the handwriting preserved on the 15-year-old note folded inside his jacket. Before he could compare them more closely, Daniel Brooks walked into the dining room wearing the same impatient expression that had become painfully familiar. He glanced across the room until his eyes settled on Emily. "Table 12 has been waiting too long," he announced loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. Emily calmly checked the order screen and answered with quiet respect. "Their meals are finishing in the kitchen now. They should be served in less than 2 minutes." Daniel dismissed her explanation with a wave of his hand. "Excuses do not make customers happy." Emily simply nodded and continued working without allowing frustration to appear on her face. William watched several employees exchange uncomfortable glances before quickly returning to their duties. The silence throughout the dining room spoke louder than Daniel's criticism. Everyone seemed accustomed to watching Emily accept treatment she had never earned. A few minutes later the meals arrived exactly when Emily had predicted. The guests thanked her for the excellent service and complimented the quality of the breakfast. Daniel offered no acknowledgement. He simply walked away searching for another problem to correct. William slowly removed the folded note from his jacket beneath the table and compared the faded handwriting with the signature Emily had just written across a customer receipt. Every curve. Every line. Every careful stroke matched so closely that the years between them suddenly felt much shorter. He folded the papers together once more, looked toward Emily with quiet disbelief, and realized the secret he had spent 15 years searching for might finally be standing only a few yards away without recognizing him at all. 2 days passed before William Hayes decided he could no longer rely on memory alone. The similarities were becoming impossible to dismiss, yet he needed one final piece of truth before allowing the past to step into the present. Early one morning he arrived at the restaurant before the first customers entered and quietly took his usual seat near the window. Outside, the streets were still waking beneath a pale sunrise. Inside, the kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and warm bread. Emily Carter moved through the dining room arranging silverware, checking each table, and greeting every employee with the same gentle kindness that never seemed forced. Nothing about her suggested she carried any extraordinary story. She simply did every ordinary task with extraordinary care. As the breakfast rush began, Daniel Brooks entered with his familiar expression of impatience. Within minutes he found another reason to criticize Emily. A supplier had delivered several cases of produce to the wrong storage area, creating confusion before opening. Without asking who had moved the shipment, Daniel immediately blamed Emily for the delay. She quietly accepted the instructions he gave, organized the boxes herself, and thanked two younger employees who volunteered to help. She never reminded Daniel that the mistake had not been hers. She never embarrassed the person who had actually made the error. William noticed the guilty expression on one nervous stock clerk standing silently in the corner. Emily caught the young man's eye for only a moment before giving him an almost invisible smile that assured him everything would be all right. The clerk lowered his head with visible relief. Watching that simple exchange answered a question William had carried for years. Genuine kindness did not depend on recognition. It existed even when no one was watching. After the morning crowd settled, William quietly asked for his check. Emily placed the receipt on the table with her usual warm smile and thanked him for visiting again. As she turned to leave, the folded paper inside William's jacket suddenly felt heavier than ever. He almost called her name, but something stopped him. If she truly was the young waitress from 15 years earlier, she had never expected repayment. Revealing the truth should happen for the right reason, not to satisfy his own emotions. William watched her disappear through the swinging kitchen doors once more, knowing the moment of silence was almost over. Somewhere beyond those doors, the secret that had connected their lives for 15 years was waiting for the exact moment to reveal itself. Friday evening brought the busiest crowd the restaurant had seen all month. Every table was occupied, conversations filled the dining room, and the kitchen moved with practiced urgency as orders flowed from one station to another. Emily Carter worked with the same steady grace she displayed every day, guiding new employees through the rush while making certain every guest felt welcomed. William Hayes quietly observed from his familiar table near the window, the folded note still resting inside his jacket. He had decided that if the right moment arrived naturally, he would finally speak. Until then, he would continue waiting. Across the room Daniel Brooks paced between the tables with growing frustration. A delayed delivery earlier that afternoon had placed the entire staff under pressure, and instead of encouraging his employees, he searched for someone to blame. His attention settled on Emily once again. Without checking the facts, he walked toward her and spoke loudly enough for customers and co-workers to hear. Every time something goes wrong, you somehow manage to be standing nearby. Maybe you are the reason this place never reaches the standard it should. The restaurant fell noticeably quieter. Several employees froze where they stood. A family stopped eating. Even the cooks looked through the kitchen window toward the dining room. Emily remained perfectly still for only a moment before answering with calm respect. The missing shipment arrived 15 minutes ago. Everything has already been organized, and every delayed table has now been served. Her voice carried neither anger nor embarrassment. It carried only simple truth. Daniel dismissed her explanation with another impatient gesture. I am not interested in excuses. Emily lowered her eyes briefly, not from shame but from the quiet discipline of someone who refused to answer disrespect with disrespect. She turned toward the next table, greeted a waiting couple with a warm smile, and continued taking their order as though nothing unusual had happened. William slowly placed his coffee cup onto the table. The sound was soft, yet in the unusual silence it seemed to echo across the room. He watched every customer looking at Emily with sympathy and every employee looking at Daniel with discomfort. 15 years earlier one anonymous act of kindness had changed the direction of his entire life. Today that same woman stood only a few yards away, once again accepting unfair judgment without defending herself. William reached into his jacket and wrapped his fingers around the old folded note. The time for silent observation had ended. The truth had waited patiently for 15 years. It deserved to be spoken with the same dignity in which it had first been given. William Hayes slowly rose from his chair, and the movement alone seemed to quiet the entire dining room. He did not raise his voice or demand anyone's attention. He simply walked toward the center of the restaurant with calm, deliberate steps until he stood beside Emily Carter. She looked at him with polite curiosity, believing he was another customer with a question about his meal. Daniel Brooks folded his arms impatiently, clearly expecting another complaint. Instead, William reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully unfolded the faded piece of paper he had carried for 15 years. The edges had softened with age, but the handwritten message remained perfectly readable. William looked at Emily before speaking in a voice so steady that every word carried naturally through the silent room. 15 years ago, I walked into a small family diner after believing I had failed at everything I had worked for. I could barely afford dinner, and I had already decided that I was going to give up on the company I had spent years trying to build. Emily listened respectfully, still unaware of where the story was leading. William continued, holding up the worn note. A young waitress noticed something I thought I had hidden from everyone. She quietly paid for my meal herself. She left this note beside the check and walked away before I could thank her. He slowly read the familiar words aloud. Everyone deserves one good meal before giving up. Tomorrow may surprise you. A gentle murmur spread across the restaurant. Several employees exchanged surprised glances while customers leaned forward, completely absorbed by the unexpected story. William carefully placed the old note beside one of Emily's freshly written customer receipts resting on the service counter. The handwriting matched with remarkable precision. Every letter carried the same graceful rhythm, the same careful lines, the same unmistakable style preserved across 15 years. Emily stared at both pages in complete silence. Her eyes moved slowly between the faded note and the recent receipt before a distant memory finally returned. She remembered the struggling young man who had sat alone near the window of her parents' small restaurant so many years earlier. She remembered quietly paying for his meal because she believed everyone deserved kindness on difficult days. She had never learned his name. She had never expected to see him again. William smiled gently. That single meal gave me enough hope to keep going. The company I almost abandoned became everything people know today. My success began with the compassion of a waitress who believed in a stranger before he believed in himself. Daniel lowered his eyes without speaking. For the first time since anyone could remember, the entire restaurant understood that the quietest person in the room had been carrying the greatest story all along. The restaurant remained unusually quiet long after William Hayes finished speaking. No one hurried back to their tables. No one reached for another order ticket. The silence carried something far stronger than surprise. It carried understanding. Emily Carter looked at the faded note once more before a gentle smile slowly appeared across her face. I remember you now, she said softly. You looked exhausted, but you kept thanking everyone even when you had almost nothing. I only wanted you to have one good meal. William smiled with quiet gratitude. You gave me much more than dinner. You gave me one more reason to believe tomorrow was worth trying. Daniel Brooks stood motionless, unable to find the confident words that had always come so easily before. Looking around the dining room, he realized every employee had witnessed the truth. The woman he had repeatedly underestimated had changed the course of a stranger's life through a simple act of kindness without ever speaking about it again. After several long moments, Daniel walked toward Emily. His voice was no longer sharp or impatient. I owe you an apology, he said sincerely. I judged your position instead of your character, and I was wrong. Emily accepted his words with the same quiet grace she had shown every day before this moment. She simply nodded and answered, we all have the chance to do better tomorrow. There was no bitterness in her voice. No desire to embarrass him in return. Only the calm belief that people could still grow. During the weeks that followed, small changes quietly transformed the restaurant. Daniel began listening before criticizing. New employees received patient guidance instead of unnecessary pressure. Team meetings started with appreciation instead of complaints. William never purchased the restaurant, never demanded special treatment for Emily, and never tried to repay her kindness with extravagant gifts. He understood that the greatest honor he could offer was respect. He established a scholarship in memory of anonymous everyday kindness, choosing never to place Emily's name on the public announcement because she preferred actions over recognition. Emily continued wearing the same waitress uniform, greeting every customer with the same warm smile that had first inspired a struggling young entrepreneur 15 years earlier. One peaceful morning William returned for breakfast as an ordinary customer. Emily placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him before he even asked. They exchanged a quiet smile that needed no explanation. Outside, the city continued rushing toward another busy day. Inside, life moved at a gentler pace, reminding everyone fortunate enough to witness it that the smallest acts often leave the deepest marks. Wealth can open doors, success can change circumstances, but a single moment of genuine kindness can change an entire life, and the people who offer it rarely realize how far its light will travel.